On March 4th, 1933, during the bleakest days of the Great Depression, newly elected President Franklin Delano Roosevelt delivered his first inaugural address. First of all, he said, "Let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself." Born in 33, the same year FDR was elected, he was my first president. I grew up with his fireside chats and his presence in movie newsreels. He was voted to 4 terms because he widened the circle, stepping into the shoes of poor people and stepping out of his Brahmin role as a rich man, educated in Harvard, a man who was said to have betrayed his class. FDR saw government as helping people, and under his presidency, he widened the circle of opportunity with the New Deal, which was immediately implemented. He took action to bring about economic relief as well as far-reaching reforms, widening the circle of benefits. Reacting to the ineffectiveness of President Hoover, American voters the following November overwhelmingly voted in favor of the democratic promise of a New Deal for the forgotten man. The New Deal generally embraced the concept of an economy aimed at achieving a balance between conflicting economic interests. FDR's fireside chats were to explain the New Deal to the citizens and what they achieved for the common man. The new administration's first objective was to alleviate the suffering of the nation's unemployed workers. Such agencies as the Works Progress Administration and the Civilian Conservation Corps were established to dispense emergency and short-term governmental aid and to provide temporary jobs. The WPA gave some 8.5 million people jobs. His construction projects produced miles of roads, public buildings, bridges, and parks. Also under the aegis were the Federal Art Project, Federal Writers Project, Federal Theater Project. The arts were not forgotten. The CCC provided national conservation work primarily for young unmarried men and included planting trees, fighting forest fires, maintaining forest roads and trails. The Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, Federal Reserve System, and the Securities and Exchange Commission were established in 1934 to restore investor confidence in the stock market by ending the stock manipulations that had led to the stock market crash. The farm program was centered in the Agricultural Adjustment Administration, which attempted to raise prices by controlling the production of staple crops through cash subsidies to farmers. In addition, the arm of the federal government reached into the area of electric power, establishing in 1933 the Tennessee Valley Authority, which was to cover a 7-state area and supply cheap electricity. The Wagner Act of 1935 increased the authority of the government in industrial nations relations and strengthened the organizing power of labor unions, establishing the National Labor Relations Board. The Fair Labor Standards Act, also called Wages and Hours Act, the first U.S. legislation to prescribe nationwide compulsory federal regulation of wages and hours. Legislation was passed to refinance shaky mortgages and guarantee bank loans for both modernization and mortgage payments. Perhaps The most far-reaching programs of the entire New Deal were the social security measures enacted in 1935 and 1939, which used employer and employee contributions to fund the provisions of old age and widows' benefits, unemployment compensation, and disability insurance. In his State of the Union address in 1941, FDR again widened the circle. He proposed the 4 freedoms that people everywhere in the world ought to enjoy: freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want, freedom from fear. He believed that democratic principles should help other democracies when they were in trouble. It was his rationale for why we should fight the fascism of Hitler and Mussolini and Japan during World War II. Many people opposed the war, but he looked at our nation as a vehicle for democracy. He listened to his wife, Eleanor, who in her travels pointed out what was needed to be done, always widening the circle. The top Allied leaders met in 1943, where they began to discuss post-war plans. Among the concepts discussed was the United Nations, an intergovernmental organization championed by Roosevelt that would replace the League of Nations after the war. Congress also passed the GI Bill, which provided benefits to World War II veterans. Roosevelt also prohibited religious and racial discrimination in the defense industry and established the Fair Employment Practice Committee, the first national program designed to prevent employment discrimination. Scholars, historians, and the public typically rank Roosevelt alongside Abraham Lincoln and George Washington as one of the 3 greatest U.S. presidents. While he did much for the American people, I fault him for not giving safe harbor to the boat of Jews escaping Hitler, for having Japanese internment camps. When he died, April 12, 1945, I was 11 years old, sitting in a booth after school at the Log Cabin Bar and Restaurant in Arley, Montana, reading Anne of Green Gables, while my mother had a beer at the crowded bar. The radio was announcing his death. People gathered, and there was a sense of personal loss for this president, FDR, always smiling, seeming at ease, though confined to a wheelchair. He was a brave figure, friendly, and with his wife, Eleanor, had widened the circle.
Hi, I'm Darla Timmons, and I am giving my talk on Lyndon Baines Johnson. I chose him because he was my commander-in-chief when I was in the military between 1967 and 70. He was our 36th president. He took over when President Kennedy was assassinated and finished out his term. He ran for another term but did not run for a second full term. So he was president between 63 and 69. He expanded the New Deal with the Great Society and did a series of domestic legislative programs to help the poor and downtrodden. After taking office, he won passage of a major tax cut, the Clean Air Act and the Civil Rights Act of 1964. After the 64 election, Johnson passed even more sweeping reforms. The Social Security and even amendments of 65 created 2 government health-run programs, Medicare and Medicaid. My husband and I have taken great advantage of Medicare. We've had several health scares, and that has benefited us greatly. He passed the Voting Rights Act in 1965, prohibiting racial discrimination in voting, and its passage enfranchised millions of Southern African Americans. Johnson declared the war on poverty and established several programs designed to aid the impoverished. He also presided over major increases in federal funding to education and the end of a period of restrictive immigration laws. In foreign affairs, he was part of the Cold War and the Vietnam War. We're not going to talk about that. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 is one of his major legislative accomplishments. He opened his January 8, 1964 State of the Union address with a public challenge to Congress stating, "Let this session of Congress be known as a session which did more for civil rights than the last 100 sessions of Congress combined." His biographer, Randall B. Woods, writes that Johnson effectively and used appeals to Judeo-Christian ethics to garner support for the civil rights law, stating that LBJ wrapped white America in a moral straitjacket. How could individuals who fervently, continuously, and overwhelmingly identified themselves with a merciful and just God continue to condone racial discrimination, police brutality, and segregation? He went on to appoint two federal judges to the Supreme Court, Abe Fortas, and he also appointed Solicitor General Thurgood Marshall to the court. Marshall became the first African-American Supreme Court justice in U.S. history. His war on poverty included passing legislation which created the Job Corps, the Peace Corps, the AmeriCorps. He signed Housing and Urban Development Act of '65 into law. He called that the single most important breakthrough in federal housing policy since the 1920s. He took an additional step on the war on poverty with an urban renewal effort, presenting to Congress in 1966 the Demonstration Cities program, so the cities could apply for millions of dollars to improve their cities and urban blight. As a result of Johnson's war on poverty, as well as a strong economy, the nationwide poverty rate fell from 20% in 1964 to 12% in 1974. I feel that Johnson was a very, very inclusive president. All of his sweeping legislation helped the entire country.
Dwight D. Ike Eisenhower, President of the United States, 1953 through 1961. When I was a preteen kid growing up in Pittsburgh, PA, the U.S. was just getting into World War II. General Eisenhower was named as Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Forces for the invasion of North Africa and later Sicily and Italy. President Roosevelt, after much haggling with Prime Minister Churchill, then promoted Eisenhower to be the Supreme Allied Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force to plan and execute the invasion of Europe. He became one of my heroes of the war. Fast forward one decade, after having volunteered to be drafted into the Army during the Korean police action, I had the privilege of serving as an honor guard for now President Dwight D. Eisenhower. when he came to Augusta, Georgia to attend the Masters Golf Tournament. When President Eisenhower took office in 1953, he almost immediately brought an end to the Korean conflict by negotiating a truce, which still holds to this day. He was my hero. He also made a determination to continue the policies of President Roosevelt's New Deal. This included Social Security, which expanded to cover an additional 10 million people. Social Security, education, and others of the nature were combined into a new cabinet-level agency named the Department of Health and Education and Welfare. All of this, much to the consternation of the GOP Old Guard, led by Robert Taft. President Roosevelt had put forth the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1944, but it got bogged down due to financing the effort. President Eisenhower had a similar vision, so he picked up on the effort and signed it into law in 1956. His vision was influenced by what he saw of the German Autobahn limited access road system. Militarily, it made a lot of sense, and it would provide many jobs for a sluggish economy. I personally think that the creation of the interstate highway system gave the American people the opportunity to explore the entire lower 48, thus making us aware of the tremendous diversity of our nation has to offer. President Eisenhower was instrumental in integrating the armed forces, though it began under Harry Truman. His administration declared that racial discrimination was a national security issue, and he signed it into law, the Civil Rights Act of 1957 and 1960. Though modest, these two pieces of legislation served as a beacon for future administrations regarding the advancement of civil rights. Dwight D. Eisenhower is considered one of the most effective presidents by many presidential scholars. His favorite breakfast, by the way, was cream chip beef on toast, fondly known as SOS. In his farewell address to the nation, he admonished us to be wary of the congressional military-industrial complex. His advisors, although, talked him into deleting the word congressional from his final address. Ike is one of my great presidential heroes.
I'm here today to talk about widening the circle of inclusivity using President Thomas Jefferson as a model. I can hear some of you jeering already, and there should be jeers. All of these presidents had flaws. All of them did things that we're not terribly proud of, but all of them made contributions. And Jefferson, in particular, held property rights on other people. He bought and sold them. He fathered children with an enslaved woman. And he contributed greatly to the extermination of native peoples with the Louisiana Purchase and other activities, other actions as president. So when we talk nice about Jefferson, it can be a hard sell. We know more about our founding fathers today than we were taught in our history classes. We have learned that the roots of our country are firmly entangled with slavery and the destruction of native peoples. So I won't ignore the bad things about Jefferson in talking about his contributions. His expressions of our nation's ideals of all men are created equal has been an inspiration to generations of Americans and much of the rest of the world. When Lincoln spoke at Gettysburg, he cited Jefferson's words. Those same words echoed on the march in Washington in 1963. Jefferson's words inspired us to be better, even though his actions often fell short. But where I see Jefferson as really qualifying for widening the circle is with his views on religion and religious freedom. Most of us take for granted that we have a choice in religion, that we can choose the religion we go to, the churches, or whether we go to church at all. But this is a pretty new concept in history. In Europe, we all know, or should know, that they fought bloody wars to decide which version of Christianity should have political power. And the idea that each person should have the ability to make up their own mind, to worship as they please, let alone not worshiping at all, seems outrageous to them. And it was dangerous. Kings and nobles, the entire apparatus of government, derived its authority from Almighty God. If you took that authority away and let people believe as they choose, how could society possibly function? Jefferson wasn't by any means the first person to advocate religious freedom, but he had great influence. And on that issue, he actually did live his values well. I discovered Jefferson's religious writings in a book called The Jefferson Bible, published by the Beacon Press. This book includes Jefferson's attempt to edit the Gospels to find the real words of Jesus. In Jefferson's view, Jesus was a great teacher of morals. He called Jesus' teachings the most sublime and benevolent code of morals which has ever been offered to man. But he claimed that this code of morals had been corrupted by the teachings of lesser men. After he left the White House, Jefferson struck up a correspondence with John Adams. He told Adams that this project of his of separating the real words of Jesus from the corruptions of lesser men is like separating wheat from the chaff. In another letter, he likened it to separating diamonds from dunghills. Jefferson was basically a one-man Jesus seminar. He sought to purify Jesus' writings and teachings, the teachings in a way that most Christians would regard as horrifying. And as president, he steadfastly refused to bring religion into the government. He did not issue a prayer for Thanksgiving or other occasions, as his predecessors had done. And he went so far as to reject the idea of chaplains in the army. In a letter to a correspondent, he referred to the wall of separation between church and state. He didn't want government to support religion. He wanted that to be a personal matter. Now, of course, part of his desire for religious freedom was certainly wrapped up in the fact that he was a heretic himself. Most biographies call him a deist, but he identified himself as a Unitarian, as did John Adams. Unlike Adams, Jefferson tried to keep his religious views secret, certain that he would be vilified for them. Indeed, the cut and paste job he did on the Gospels, he published under the title, The Life and Morals of Jesus of Nazareth. And he hid its true intent by saying it was for the use of the Indians, unembarrassed with matters of fact or faith beyond their level of comprehension, which brings us back to Jefferson's deficiencies. The best that can be said about Jefferson with respect to Native Americans is that he believed what nearly every other white person in this country did believe. The Louisiana Purchase is considered his greatest accomplishment as president, but it also guaranteed the extermination of native peoples and their culture. When he died, Jefferson's enslaved people were sold at auction to pay his extensive debts. Only Sally Hemings and his children by her gained their freedom. So we won't idolize Jefferson today. We can't make him a hero, but neither can we dismiss him. He had enormous highs and lows. I like, personally, that Jefferson saw Jesus as a teacher, a human teacher. I can relate to that, unlike the divine Jesus that normally is preached in churches. The question, what would Jesus do, has meaning if we see Jesus as a human teacher instead of some version of God. The moral teachings ascribed to this human Jesus may be stretch goals, but they may also be within our reach as mere humans. And I think we need to see Jefferson and all of our presidents in something like that same light, as imperfect humans. If we liberate ourselves from hero worship, we can aspire to be better citizens ourselves, to live up to our ideals, and improve the world we have been given.